There's a version of the world that exists only in the gaps, in the space between a name on an old map and the name on the map that replaced it, in the inch of shadow under a window that used to open onto daylight and now opens onto dirt, in the silence after a fire that took everything except, somehow, the things it would have been most convenient to lose. I didn't go looking for it. I was looking at something small, a photograph, a window, a building that didn't quite match its own blueprints, and I followed it the way you follow a thread on a sweater, just to see how far it goes. It went further than I expected, into archives that end exactly where they should begin, into buildings that exist without a single record of being built, into a map 200 years old with a country on it the size of a continent, a country that today simply isn't there, into a frozen, empty stretch of nothing at the bottom of the world that somehow earned its own treaty before almost anyone had set foot on it. I'm not going to tell you what connects these. I'm not sure anything does. Maybe it's all just dust, the ordinary boring residue of a world that's been rebuilding itself for centuries, leaving behind nothing but mismatched paperwork and bad luck. But every time I find the edge of one of these gaps, there's another one waiting just behind it. The same shape, the same silence, over and over. So here's what I found. 10 of them for now, and one question that I haven't been able to put down since. Mystery 1, the Mudflood. Here's the thing about mud. Mud doesn't lie, or rather mud doesn't editorialize. It doesn't care about your historical narrative. It just falls and settles and stays exactly where it landed until something digs it out. So when you find meters of compacted soil sitting on top of architectural details, window ledges, decorative stonework, ornamental ironwork that were clearly designed to be seen, designed to be at street level, designed to be the face a building presents to the world, you have to ask, how did it get covered? The mainstream answer, when there is one, tends to be vague. The ground level rose over time. Streets were repaved repeatedly and the level crept up. Cities naturally accumulate sediment. And look, I want to be fair here. That does happen. Archaeologists call it tell formation. Cities built on top of older cities, layer after layer, over thousands of years. Rome is famously built on top of itself many times over. That's real. That's documented. That's slow. But here's where the official explanation starts to wobble. The buildings we're talking about, the ones with buried first floors, are, according to their own historical records, often less than 150 to 200 years old. We're not talking about ancient Rome. We're talking about Victorian-era construction. Buildings with iron framework, with photographable construction dates, with architects whose names are on file. And yet, meters of soil, not centimeters. Meters. For a building that's supposedly less than 2 centuries old to accumulate that much sediment, you'd need an extraordinary rate of deposition. Decades worth of slow urban accumulation compressed into, what exactly? A handful of years? A single event? This raises a simple but critical question. If it happens slowly, where's the documentation? Cities keep records. They keep records of everything: tax assessments, construction permits, street grading projects, sewer installations. If a city spent 50 years gradually raising its street level by 2 meters, there would be a paper trail. Engineers would have written about it. Newspapers would have covered it. Street raised 3 feet, residents complain. That's the kind of thing 19th century newspapers loved to report on. So where is it? The deeper I went, the more I noticed something else. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. It's not just St. Petersburg. It's not just one country, one architectural tradition, one climate. Look at the basement-level windows in row houses across the eastern United States, particularly the ones with ornate stone or cast-iron surrounds, clearly meant to be decorative, clearly meant to be seen, now sitting half-buried with bars over them, often filled in entirely with brick. Look at the so-called souterrains and lower levels found beneath buildings in cities like Edinburgh, entire streets and chambers that, according to some accounts, were simply built over, sealed and forgotten, only to be rediscovered generations later as if they were some kind of secret the city itself didn't know it had. Look at Seattle, where an underground network of storefronts and sidewalks sits below the modern street grade, officially explained as the result of a regrading project after a fire. One fire. One regrading project. That's the story for an entire underground city. Does that single explanation, one fire, one regrade, actually account for the consistency of this pattern across cities that had no fire, no regrade, and in some cases, no documented reason to bury anything at all? And here's the strangest part. When you look at old photographs, and I mean photographs, not paintings, not illustrations, actual photographic evidence from the mid to late 1800s, you sometimes catch buildings during what looks like the burial process. Mounds of dirt piled against facades, windows half covered, doors that open onto walls of packed earth like someone started shoveling and just stopped partway through. What event leaves a half-finished burial job on buildings across multiple continents? I keep coming back to scale. Not the scale of a building or a street or even a city, but the scale of everywhere. If this were isolated to one region, you could chalk it up to a regional flood, a regional engineering quirk, a regional reporting gap. But it's not isolated, it's worldwide. St. Petersburg, Paris, London, New York, Chicago, Sydney. The pattern repeats on different continents, in different climates, under different governments, with different building materials. And somehow the result looks the same everywhere. A buried ground floor, a new ground floor built on top, and an official history that simply doesn't mention it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start looking at old buildings differently. You notice the windows that are too low, the doors that don't quite reach the ground, the basements that feel less like basements and more like floors that used to have daylight. The official explanation collapses here for me, not because I have a better one, I don't, but because the silence is what doesn't add up. A genuinely slow, centuries-long urban process would have an enormous documentary footprint. A genuinely sudden, catastrophic event, something that buried entire ground floors in a matter of years or months or days, would also have a footprint. Newspapers, diaries, engineering reports, something. Instead, there's this strange gap. The buildings exist, the buried floors exist, the photographs exist. But the explanation, the actual on the record, here's what happened and when explanation, is almost nowhere to be found. And that absence, more than anything else, is what kept me looking. Because if it really was nothing, if it really was just slow sediment and old streets, why does it feel like nobody wants to talk about it? Mystery. 2. Antarctica. What the early expeditions found beneath the ice. I'll admit, when I first started looking into Antarctica, I expected nothing. It's ice. It's the most remote, most hostile, most empty place on the planet. What could possibly connect a frozen continent at the bottom of the world to buried buildings in St. Petersburg? And then I started reading about the timeline. And the timeline is strange. For most of human history, Antarctica was a rumour. A great southern land that mapmakers assumed had to exist for reasons of symmetry, but that nobody had actually seen. Then in the early 1800s, things changed quickly. Sealers and explorers started reporting sightings. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, full expeditions were underway. Shackleton, Scott, Amundsen, and later, in the 1930s and 40s, larger, more heavily funded operations. Here's the part that gets me. The scale of some of these later expeditions seems almost disproportionate to what you'd expect for mapping some ice. Take Operation High Jump, the US Navy's massive 1946-47 Antarctic expedition. We're talking about something like 4,700 personnel, multiple aircraft carriers, submarines, icebreakers, an operation that, on paper, was framed as training exercises and mapping work. Training exercises for ice. Now, I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds. Militaries do conduct cold weather training. Mapping expeditions do require significant logistics. None of this is by itself evidence of anything, but it's the pattern that gets under my skin. Why does the historical interest in Antarctica seem to spike so dramatically right around the same era, when so many of these other anomalies, the buried cities, the architectural shifts, the rebuilding of the world, were also happening? Is that a coincidence? Maybe. Probably even. But probably isn't the same as definitely, and once you've seen enough probablys stack up in the same direction, they start to feel less like noise and more like a signal. And then there's the matter of access. Antarctica today is governed by the Antarctic Treaty System, established in 1959, an international agreement that, among other things, restricts military activity, sets aside the continent for peaceful purposes, and creates a framework of inspection and oversight unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. On the surface, that sounds great. International cooperation, scientific preservation, and it absolutely has been used for legitimate, valuable scientific research, ice core samples, climate data, astronomy. I'm not disputing that. But ask yourself this: why does the one place on Earth that's hardest to get to, hardest to survive in, and least economically useful in any conventional sense, also happen to be the place with the most formalized, internationally codified restrictions on what countries are allowed to do there? We don't have an Amazon rainforest treaty with this level of universal buy-in. We don't have a Sahara Desert treaty. Both of those places are also remote, also hard to access, also full of unexplored regions. But Antarctica gets its own international legal framework signed by every major power with remarkable speed in the years following a period of unprecedented military interest in the continent. Why? The official answer is some combination of avoiding Cold War territorial disputes, preserving the continent for science, and preventing militarization during a tense geopolitical moment. And that's a coherent explanation. I don't want to pretend otherwise. But here's where it gets strange for me. Some of the earliest expedition logs and accounts, particularly from the late 1800s and early 1900s, before the big treaty-era operations, include descriptions that are frankly a little odd. References to unusual readings, references to terrain that didn't match expectations, references, in some cases, to things that were seen but never followed up on, never fully explained, never mentioned again in any official capacity. I'm not going to pretend I can tell you what those references mean. Maybe they're just the normal confusion of explorers operating in an environment unlike anything they'd encountered before. Frozen landscapes do strange things to instruments, to perception, to memory. That's a real phenomenon. I don't want to oversell this. But this raises a simple but critical question. If there's truly nothing there but ice, why does the one continent with nothing on it have the most tightly controlled access of anywhere on Earth? And it makes me think about the Mudflood again, about buried ground floors, about a pattern of things being covered, not destroyed, not erased entirely, but covered, put under something, hidden in a way that leaves the original mostly intact, just inaccessible. What if the thing under the ice isn't so different from the thing under the streets? I don't know. I genuinely don't. But the silence around Antarctica feels like the same kind of silence I found in St. Petersburg. Not a silence that says, there's nothing here. A silence that says, we'd rather you stopped asking. And we're just getting started. Mystery 3, the renaming of over 1,000 cities. I want to start with something small, almost embarrassingly small, a name, not a battle, not a buried foundation, not a vanished people, just a name, and the sudden coordinated government-stamped removal of thousands of them within a window of history that's almost suspiciously narrow. Because here's what kept nagging at me. You don't need to demolish a civilization to erase it from memory. You don't need to burn every record, though. Stick around. We'll get to that one too. You just need to change what things are called. Do it fast enough, completely enough, in enough places at once, and within a generation or two, Nobody remembers what used to be there. Let's start in France. The year is 1793. The revolution is consuming everything: kings, churches, the calendar itself, rebuilt from year one. We're told this was about politics, punishment, making the old world disappear and replacing it with something rational. Fine, I'll grant that as far as it goes. But look at what got renamed and how fast. Lyon, one of the oldest, largest cities on the continent, had its name stripped by official decree and replaced with Communia Franchi, the liberated commune. Not a nickname, a legal substitution. Marseille got something even stranger: Ville sans nom, the city without a name. Sit with that for a second. A city of hundreds of thousands of people, one of the oldest continuously inhabited ports in Europe, officially, administratively, rendered nameless. Not renamed to something else, just unnamed. The justification given was punishment. These cities had resisted the central government, so their names were taken as a penalty. Okay. But then the renaming didn't stop at the guilty cities. It spread outward, smaller towns, villages with no rebellion on their record at all, reclassified anyway. And when you start lining up the decree dates, not the broad sweep of the revolutionary period, but the actual paperwork, you don't get a slow rolling wave of local political punishments trickling out over months. You get clusters, multiple cities in different regions renamed on the same days, in a country where the fastest way to move information was a man on a horse. What kind of administrative machinery in 1793 coordinates simultaneous renaming across an entire nation with that kind of precision? The histories don't really say. The silence is, frankly, deafening. Now jump a century, cross an ocean. It's 1894. The United States Board on Geographic Names, an agency that had existed for all of 4 years, issues something called Order 114. This one isn't about punishing rebels, it's quieter than that, and somehow that makes it stranger. Order 114 systematically strips specific words out of place names, nationwide, in a single administrative action. Old, new, ridge, valley. Gone, not from one town, but from hundreds, overnight. The official reasoning's postal efficiency. Too many duplicate names, the mail system can't cope, standardize and move on. Reasonable enough, on its face. Except for one number that I cannot make sit comfortably in that explanation. Of the roughly 323 American place name changes recorded around this action, 157, nearly half, happened in Illinois. One state, almost half the entire national total. I tried, genuinely, to make this fit the postal story. Was Illinois' mail system uniquely chaotic? Were Illinoisans unusually sentimental about the word ridge? Was there something about the prairie that produced an epidemic of towns called old this or that? Or is Illinois, specifically the Illinois River Corridor, the upper Mississippi Basin, simply the place where the most renaming was, for some reason, considered necessary? Because that same stretch of country is where 19th century surveyors kept stumbling onto things that didn't fit. Earthworks on a scale nobody could explain. Engineered waterways more sophisticated than anything the documented settlement era should have produced. Alignments that matched no known building tradition, indigenous or colonial. And in 1894, the names pointing backward toward all of that, the olds, the valleys, the ridges, quietly stopped existing. That's how you erase something without lighting a single match. You don't touch the place. You just take away the word that used to make people ask, old what? A generation later, nobody asks, why would they? It's just a name now. There's one more piece of this that I think about constantly because, unlike almost everything else in this list, it comes with a confession. In 1867, a settler named Darrell Duper was looking out over a stretch of Arizona desert. The land was crossed by an enormous network of irrigation canals, hundreds of miles of them, precisely engineered, already there, already capable of moving water at a scale the incoming settlers themselves would rely on for decades. They didn't dig these canals. They cleaned them out and turned the water back on. Dupper looked at this inherited infrastructure, at a civilization's leftovers doing the work of a civilization that no longer existed, and he proposed a name for the new town being built on top of it. Phoenix, the bird that rises from its own ashes. He said so explicitly at the time. This is documented. Not alternative history, the founder's own stated reasoning. A new settlement, naming itself after rebirth from ruin, on top of engineering nobody currently living had built, and nobody currently living fully understood. And around that same window, the same decades when Lyon and Marseille were losing their names, when Order 114 was quietly editing the American map, something else was happening on the world's maps too. Go back to the cartography of the 1600s and 1700s, Mercator, Ortelius, Blaeu, the French royal surveyors, and you'll find a vast territorial label stretching across northern and central Asia, Tartaria. Grand Tartary, not a footnote, a major feature on the foundational maps of Western geography. Then, across roughly the same century we've been tracing, the renaming century, Tartaria shrinks. Fragments, gets absorbed into new national designations. By the mid-1800s, it's simply gone from the maps, as if it had always been a placeholder waiting to be replaced. One country renaming its cities, I could call coincidence. One postal order, I could call bureaucracy. One settler's poetic choice of name, I could call a nice story, but all of it in the same 100-year window? Cities stripped of names in single days, a federal order erasing the word old from hundreds of towns concentrated with eerie precision in one region, a desert city naming itself after rising from someone else's ruins, and a name that once covered a third of Asia, quietly retired from the maps of the world. The evidence suggests something much larger than any one of these events can explain on its own. I'm not telling you what it adds up to. I'm telling you that once you line up the dates side by side, France, Illinois, Phoenix, Tartaria, you stop being able to call it coincidence. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. Mystery. 4. The Tartarian architectural style. I need you to picture a building. I'll describe it, and as I go, I want you to try and guess where it is. A dome, not flat, not a simple peaked roof, but a true dome, sometimes stacked with a smaller dome or spire on top, like a layered cake of architecture. A facade lined with columns, classical in feel but mixed with ornamentation, that doesn't belong to any single tradition you'd learn in an art history survey. Arched windows tall enough to dwarf a person. Stonework around the entrances, scrollwork, carved figures, sometimes statues built directly into the structure rather than placed in front of it, as if the building and the sculpture were conceived as one object, and over all of it an impression of wealth and permanence that feels less like civic pride and more like a statement aimed at something beyond the people walking past. Where is it? Here's the thing. That description fits a government building in St. Petersburg. It fits an opera house in Vienna. It fits a train station in Mumbai. It fits a former department store in Chicago, a courthouse in rural Indiana, a palace in Buenos Aires, a post office in a town you've never heard of with a population that's never cracked 5 figures. The same visual language, the same domes, the same proportions, the same decorative vocabulary across continents, across cultures that, by the official record, had little to no shared architectural lineage, little to no direct contact. During the era these buildings were supposedly designed and built. The standard answer is neoclassicism, a shared aesthetic movement spread by architects trained in similar academies, exported through colonialism and trade, and the simple fact that 19th century elites everywhere wanted to look like Rome. And I want to give that explanation its due because it's not nothing. Styles do travel. We can trace, with named architects and named projects, how something like Gothic Revival or Beaux-Arts spread from country to country. But here's where it starts to strain. Trace those lines of influence for specific buildings, particularly the ones way out at the edges of the map, geographically speaking, and the trail goes cold fast. A train station in a small American town built, we're told, in the 1870s or 1880s, displaying the full Tartarian vocabulary, dome, statuary, soaring stonework, and when you ask which architect trained where, influenced by what specific European project, the answer is often vague. A name, maybe a firm, rarely a documented design lineage you can actually follow back to a source. And then there's the function problem. A train station needs a platform, a ticket window, somewhere to wait out of the rain. That's the job of the building. So why does the job, again and again, come wrapped in architecture that looks like it was designed for something else, something ceremonial, something monumental, and only later had train station bolted onto it as a use case? I started noticing this pattern specifically with small town depots, towns with populations in the low thousands, sometimes lower, possessing rail stations with details and materials that would be eye-wateringly expensive today, with modern equipment, modern logistics, modern labour markets. The official story is usually some version of a wealthy benefactor or civic ambition outpacing the town's actual size. And sometimes, sure, that's probably exactly what happened. Boom towns built big because they expected to stay big, but sometimes isn't always. And the cases that don't fit, the ones where the architecture seems to wildly exceed not just the population, but the economic logic of the place, are the ones that keep adding up. Then there's the timeline problem, and this is the one that really got under my skin. Look at the construction dates attributed to some of these large, ornate, structurally complex buildings, and then compare them honestly to how long it would take to build something equivalent today, with cranes, with prefabricated materials, with a worldwide supply chain. In more than a few cases, the historical timeline is shorter, groundbreaking to grand opening in a matter of months for a structure that, by any modern estimate, should take years. Now, I know the counter-argument. Pre-industrial and early industrial labour was organised differently. Enormous workforces doing by hand what we now do by machine can move fast. Cathedrals took generations, sure, but some civic projects genuinely were rushed through with armies of labourers working in shifts. That's real. I don't want to wave that away. What I can't wave away is the silence around the process. Big projects, especially rushed ones, generate friction, cost overruns, labour disputes, supply shortages, newspaper complaints about the noise, the dust, the disruption to the town square for 18 months. That's the texture of a real construction project, and it shows up in the record for plenty of buildings from this era. But for an unsettling number of the most Tartarian buildings, the most ornate, the most domed, the most statuary-laden, that texture is just absent. The record starts at, here is the finished building, opened on this date, attributed to this architect. No mess, no mud, no process, just an arrival. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, continent after continent. The same style, the same scale, the same gap where the story of construction should be. And here's the part I keep turning over, the part that feels less like architecture and more like forensics. A lot of these grand, domed, statue-laden buildings, once you look past their current label, seem to have a kind of purpose-agnostic grandeur. They get used as train stations, sure, but also post offices, also courthouses, also libraries, museums, exhibition halls, government ministries. The function keeps changing, building to building, city to city, but the form stays remarkably consistent. As if the form came first and the function got assigned afterward, almost arbitrarily, based on whatever a growing town happened to need a big building for at the time. What if that's exactly what happened? What if, instead of designed as a train station in 1880 in the Tartarian style, the more honest sentence for some of these buildings is closer to already existing in 1880, repurposed as a train station because a growing town needed a train station, and there happened to be an enormous, ornate, structurally sound building just sitting there. That would explain the missing construction mess. You can't generate cost overruns and labour disputes for a building you didn't build. It would explain the speed, renovation and repurposing is a lot faster than design and construct from bare ground. And it would explain the strange mismatch between form and function, grandeur that doesn't quite suit the job, because the grandeur was never for the job in the first place. I want to be careful here, because I'm aware of exactly how far this line of thinking can be pushed, and I don't want to push it past where the evidence actually goes. I am not saying every ornate 19th century building is secretly ancient. Most of them probably are exactly what the records say they are, genuine products of a genuinely ambitious era. But most leaves room for some. And the some, the ones with the gaps, the silences, the form-function mismatches, the timelines that don't add up, are scattered across every continent in a style so consistent it has practically earned its own name among the people who've noticed it. If even a fraction of these buildings were inherited rather than built, found, not constructed, then the question stops being who built all this beautiful architecture in the 1800s and becomes something closer to who built it the first time and what happened to them. Mystery 5. The hidden royal bloodlines. This next one started, for me, not with a building or a map, but with a list of names, specifically a list of titles. Europe's aristocracy is obsessed with lineage. That's not controversial. It's the entire point of a hereditary system. Royal houses keep meticulous genealogical records stretching back centuries, often with elaborate charts showing exactly how one dynasty connects to another through marriage, conquest, or convenient adoption. So I started doing something simple. I started looking at where certain titles came from, specifically titles that reference territories or peoples that, according to the maps we just talked about, either shrank dramatically or vanished entirely during that same 18th to 19th century window. And I found something I wasn't expecting. Titles that outlived the places they were named for, a title referencing a Tartar Khanate, or a steppe principality, or a regional designation that no longer corresponds to any territory on a modern map, still held, still passed down, still listed in genealogical records, generations after the thing it supposedly governed stopped existing in any administrative sense. Now, on its own, that's not necessarily strange. European nobility is full of titular honours, ceremonial titles to places a family hasn't actually ruled in centuries. Duke of Nowhere in particular is a running joke for a reason. Most of these are understood by everyone involved to be vestigial, nice to put on a business card, meaningless in practice. But a few of these titles are different. A few of them come attached not just to a name, but to specific heraldic elements, crests, sigils, symbolic motifs that don't show up anywhere else in European heraldry except in connection with that one vanished designation. Symbols that, if Tartaria really was just a vague catch-all term Europeans used for unexplored Asia, shouldn't have a coherent heraldic tradition at all. You don't usually get a consistent coat of arms for a place that was never a real political entity. And yet, there it is, specific symbols, specific lineages, specific families still around today, still quietly carrying titles and crests that point back to a territorial designation that, according to the maps, was administratively absorbed and renamed out of existence within a single century. This raises a question I genuinely don't know how to answer responsibly, and I want to say that plainly. Was this absorption as total as the maps suggest? If a territory gets folded into new national borders, renamed, reclassified, does its ruling class simply vanish too? Or does it do what ruling classes throughout history have always done when borders shift underneath them? It marries in. It keeps its symbols quietly as heirlooms. It keeps its bloodline and lets the territory dissolve into the new map while the family dissolves into the new aristocracy. Russian, Austrian, German, wherever the marriage is led. If that happened, and I want to stress if, then the disappearance of Tartaria from the map wouldn't mean the disappearance of the people who once held power within it. It would mean something stranger, a ruling lineage that survived the erasure of the place it once represented, carried forward inside family trees that, on paper, belong entirely to other nations. I went looking for documentation of this directly. Some kind of acknowledged this family's title technically derives from a pre-absorption Tartar designation, and what I found instead was, again, a kind of structured vagueness. Titles whose origin is described in official genealogies as ancient or of disputed antiquity, with the specific territorial route left frustratingly unexamined. As if the question, where exactly did this title come from, and what happened to that place, was one that genealogists, for whatever reason, preferred not to follow all the way down. I don't think there's a smoking gun here. I think there's something quieter and, in a way, more unsettling. A possibility that the people who once sat at the top of whatever Tartaria actually was didn't vanish along with the name. They just rebranded, quietly. Through marriage, through new titles, through the same kind of administrative absorption that swallowed the cities and the maps, the land lost its name. The Bloodlines may not have. Mystery 6. The Tartary entry in Encyclopedia Britannica. I want to show you something that takes about 30 seconds to find and a lifetime to fully sit with. Pull up the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, 1771, 3 volumes compiled in Edinburgh, intended as a comprehensive summary of human knowledge for an educated reader of the time. Look up Tartary, it's there. Not as a footnote, not as a vague aside about unexplored regions of Asia. It's described in that edition in terms that place it among the largest countries, by some framings the largest contiguous landmass on the planet, stretching from the borders of Russia and China across an enormous swath of the continent, divided into recognizable subregions: Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, independent Tartary, each treated as a real describable place, the way the encyclopedia treats France or Persia or the Ottoman Empire. This is not some marginal almanac, this is the reference work, the book a person in 1771 would reach for if they wanted to know definitively what countries existed and how big they were. And Tartary is one of them. A big one. Now go forward. Edition by edition, decade by decade. By the early 1800s, the entry starts to shrink. The territory it describes contracts. Subregions that were once treated as distinct begin to merge or vanish or get folded into descriptions of other countries. Russia, China, as if Tartary was simply an old-fashioned umbrella term for territory that actually belonged to someone else all along. By the mid-1800s, Tartary as a standalone entry is functionally gone. What's left is a historical curiosity, a word you might find in a footnote about outdated cartography, the way you might mention that people used to call the Atlantic the Western Ocean. This raises a simple but critical question. How does the largest country on Earth, as documented in the most authoritative reference work of its time, simply stop being a country? Not through war, not through a documented treaty carving it up between rival powers, at least not one that maps cleanly onto the scale of what disappeared. Just a gradual editorial contraction, edition after edition, until the space it used to occupy on the map quietly becomes part of someone else's territory. The official explanation, when you can get anyone to engage with the question at all, is the same one we keep running into. Tartary was never a real political entity. It was a vague European label for the unknown bits of Asia, and as European knowledge of the region improved through the 1700s and 1800s, the label got retired in favour of more accurate, more specific national designations. And look, I get why that's the comfortable answer. Maps from this era genuinely did contain placeholder regions, areas where cartographers filled in blank space with their best guess, and a label that meant, essentially, we think something is here. But Tartary doesn't read like that kind of placeholder. Placeholders are vague. They're drawn with dotted lines, hedged language, regions believed to be inhabited by... The 1771 Britannica entry isn't hedged. It describes governance. It describes peoples. It describes in the kind of specific, confident detail that a reference work uses for places its editors consider real, known and stable, a functioning geopolitical space. You don't write that about a blank spot on the map. You write that about a country. And here's where it connects back to everything else we've already walked through. Because this is the exact same window, the late 1700s through the mid-1800s, where we watched French cities lose their names overnight, where an American federal order quietly stripped backward-looking place names from hundreds of towns, 157 of them in one state alone, where a desert town named itself after rising from someone else's ruins, and where an architectural style identical across continents seems to arrive without a documented construction process. And now we have the actual reference work, the book whose entire job was to tell people what was real, quietly walking back, edition by edition, its description of the largest country on the planet. I don't think any single edition of the Britannica is lying. Exactly. I think each edition probably reflected, in good faith, the best information its editors had at the time. That's what makes this so unsettling. It's not one bad entry. It's a trend. A slow, multi-decade convergence across multiple editors, multiple decades, toward the same conclusion. This place doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it never quite did, not the way the 1771 edition implied. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The map shrinks. The encyclopedia shrinks to match. The names on the ground change to match the new map. And by the time you reach the 20th century, Tartary is something you encounter only in old book titles and the names of geographic features. The Tartar Strait, still on the map today, a thin channel of water that's practically the only surviving fragment of a word that in 1771 described a third of a continent. A strait, that's what's left. A strait and a steppe people's modern ethnonym detached from any territorial claim at all. Once you've seen the renaming, once you've seen the architecture, once you've seen the maps, and then you open the actual encyclopedia, the supposedly neutral, supposedly authoritative record, and watch it perform the exact same contraction on the exact same timeline. You start to wonder whether the encyclopedia was ever just a record of what was happening to the world, or whether in its own quiet editorial way it was part of what was happening to the world. Mystery 7. The worldwide burning of pre-1800 books. Here's an assumption I carried for most of my life without ever examining it. That libraries are deep. That somewhere, in some climate-controlled vault, there's an unbroken chain of physical books and manuscripts stretching back through the Renaissance, through the medieval period, into antiquity, fragile, sure, rare, sure, but there, the actual paper, the actual ink, the actual objects that people centuries ago held in their hands. Try to actually go find them. Ask a major library for original, unrestored, pre-1750 manuscripts, not facsimiles, not 19th century reprints, not editions based on the actual physical documents. What you find again and again isn't abundance, it's scarcity. And the scarcity comes with an explanation attached every single time. And the explanation is almost always some version of the same word. Fire. Individually, each one sounds plausible. Buildings burn. It happens. But once I started writing these down, not as isolated trivia, but as a timeline, something shifted. 1666. London. The Great Fire doesn't just level a medieval city, it consumes St. Paul's Cathedral and the library housed within it, a repository of pre-Reformation English texts. 1671, Spain. A major fire tears through the Escorial monastery, taking with it manuscripts from the Islamic period of Iberian history and earlier Christian texts alike. 1728, Copenhagen. The university library burns, and with it go what are described as the only surviving copies of a number of Norse and Danish historical texts. Sources that, once gone, simply cannot be replaced because nothing else, like them, existed. 1731. London again. A fire at Ashburnham House badly damages the Cotton Library, a collection containing some of the oldest surviving manuscripts in the English-speaking world, including unique Anglo-Saxon material. 1755. Lisbon. An earthquake and the fires that follow destroy the Royal Library, the Jesuit archives, and an untold number of private collections, centuries of Portuguese exploration records gone in days. 1794. France. In the chaos of the Revolution, aristocratic and church libraries across the country are emptied and destroyed, not incidentally, but systematically, as part of the broader project of erasing the old order. 1812. Moscow. As Napoleon's army retreats, the city burns, and with it the Kremlin's archives and library collections. 1814. Washington. The young Library of Congress, barely a generation old, loses its entire collection, the foundational reference texts of American governance, in a single event. Lay these out on a timeline, and you get something that doesn't look like history is fragile and things sometimes burn. You get a cluster. Roughly 1650 to 1850, 200 years give or take, during which an extraordinary share of the world's pre-modern written record seems to have been consumed by fire, flood, or war in institution after institution, country after country. And it's not just Europe and America. Go back further and you find the same kind of event, repeating across cultures that had no contact with each other. Constantinople's libraries burned during the Fourth Crusade, and again during later conquests. Baghdad's House of Wisdom, by some accounts one of the greatest libraries the world had ever produced, destroyed in 1258. Nalanda, one of the great centres of learning in India, its library burned in the late 1100s. Different centuries, different continents, different religions, different empires, different languages. Same result, the library burns, the knowledge inside it doesn't transfer, and the next era inherits not the texts themselves, but descriptions of texts, summaries, references, second-hand accounts of what supposedly used to be there. This is where the official explanation, for me, doesn't collapse exactly, but it strains under its own weight. Because wars are chaotic and chaotic things burn doesn't explain precision. War zone fires tend to be indiscriminate. They take houses, markets, barracks, libraries, everything, more or less proportionally. But again and again in this list, what gets singled out, what gets specifically named in the aftermath as a catastrophic loss to knowledge, is the library, the archive, the specific room where the old texts were kept. And here's the detail that I can't stop turning over, the one that moves this from tragic pattern to pattern that demands a question. While public and institutional libraries were burning on this remarkable schedule, monastery collections, university libraries, royal archives, national repositories, the private libraries of certain long-established aristocratic families were not. You can see it in the portraiture. Royal and noble families, photographed in the mid to late 1800s, posed in private libraries with shelves of leather-bound volumes receding into shadow. Collections that, by their own family histories, predate the entire 1650 to 1850 burning window, intact, inherited. Still, in many cases, sitting behind locked doors on private estates today, unavailable to the researchers who would need exactly this kind of unbroken pre-1800 material to actually verify the histories built on top of its absence everywhere else. I want to be careful here because this is the point where it would be very easy to lean into something darker than the evidence actually supports, and I'm not going to name families or claim some kind of organised plot. I don't know that, and I'm not going to pretend I do, but I can ask the question plainly. Why would the same 2 centuries that saw the renaming of cities, the contraction of Tartary, and the sudden appearance of a world-spanning uniform architectural style, also be the 2 centuries that saw the near total destruction of the public, verifiable, pre-modern written record? And why would that destruction be so selective in what burned, institutional, public, accessible, versus what didn't, private, sealed, inherited? What we're left with, on the public side of that line, is a history that effectively starts around 1800. Not because nothing happened before then, obviously it did, but because everything we can independently verify, with physical documents we can actually examine clusters after the fires. Everything before is second-hand. Translations of translations, summaries of things we're told used to exist, written by the institutions that took shape in the fire's aftermath. The evidence suggests something much larger than carelessness. Maybe it really is coincidence, 2 centuries of bad luck, repeated independently, on every continent, in every culture, always landing on the libraries. Maybe. But if you wanted to make a past unverifiable, not erase it outright, just make it impossible to check, you wouldn't need a conspiracy with a memo and a signature. You'd just need enough fires, in enough places, over enough time, that by the time anyone thought to ask, wait, what did the original say? There was nothing left to compare it to. And then you'd need 200 years of silence, which is exactly what we got. Mystery. 8. Giant skeletons and the Smithsonian silence. I want to end this first part with the mystery that more than any other made me understand why people get so heated about all of this. Because this isn't a story about maps or buildings or library fires. This one is about bodies, and bodies are different. Bodies are personal. Here's where it starts. Newspapers. If you spend any time in digitized newspaper archives from the 1800s, and I mean actual archives, scanned local papers from small towns across America, not curated best of collections, you start noticing something. Reports, dozens of them, hundreds by some counts, short articles, usually a paragraph or two, tucked into local news sections alongside crop reports and church socials, describing the discovery of human skeletal remains of extraordinary size. 7 feet, 8 feet, in some accounts more, found in burial mounds, found during construction excavations, found by farmers ploughing fields, described again and again in the flat, unremarkable tone of local news, not as miracles, not as hoaxes being exposed, just reported. The way you'd report a large fish being caught, I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of claim that's easy to get swept up in, and I think it deserves real scrutiny rather than just excitement. First, 19th century newspapers were not held to the standards we'd expect today. Sensationalism sold papers. Giant skeleton found is a headline that moves copies, regardless of whether anyone actually measured anything carefully. Many of these reports almost certainly involve some combination of exaggeration, misidentification, mastodon or mammoth bones mistaken for human remains, for instance, which absolutely did happen and is documented, and outright fabrication for a slow news day. So if this were 5 reports, or even 50, scattered randomly, I don't think it would be worth dwelling on. Newspapers exaggerate. That's not news, but the volume is what gets me. And more specifically, the consistency, not just in the measurements, which vary, but in the circumstances. An overwhelming number of these reports describe the remains being found in or near earthen mounds, the same mound building cultures whose structures are scattered across the American Midwest and South, structures we now attribute officially to various indigenous cultures collectively grouped under labels like mound builders, Adena, Hopewell, and others. And here's where the story gets a second layer, because the attribution of these mounds is itself a story. For much of the 1800s, there was genuine, serious scholarly debate about who built these mounds. Some 19th century researchers, credentialed, working for legitimate institutions, argued that the mounds were too sophisticated, too numerous, and represented too much accumulated labour to have been built by the ancestors of the native peoples living in the region at the time of European contact. This wasn't fringe pseudoscience at the time. It was a live academic question, debated in journals, argued over for decades. Some researchers proposed a separate, vanished mound builder civilization, distinct from and prior to the historical tribes. That theory has since been thoroughly rejected, and for good reason. The rejection wasn't some cover-up. It came from genuine archaeological work demonstrating clear continuity between mound-building cultures and the indigenous peoples of the region. Work that corrected a racially motivated 19th century narrative that had been used explicitly to deny the native peoples credit for their own ancestors' achievements. That correction matters, and I don't want to wave past it because the history of lost civilization theories in North America is deeply entangled with the history of justifying dispossession. These mounds are too advanced for the people we're displacing, so they must have been built by someone else who must have died out, so we're not really taking anything from anyone. That's not a neutral footnote. That's the actual function a lot of ancient lost civilization talk served for a very long time, and I think it's important to say that plainly. Now, so why am I still bringing up the giant skeletons? Because the newspaper reports, whatever their reliability, exist within this same period, often describing excavations connected to mound sites, often describing remains that local accounts insisted didn't match the skeletal profile of anyone in the surrounding population living or buried elsewhere. And then, and this is the part that actually launched me down this particular road, a notable number of these reports describe the remains being shipped off, sent to a museum, sent back east, sent specifically in several accounts to the Smithsonian Institution. And then, nothing. No follow-up, no catalogue entry that obviously corresponds, no published study confirming or debunking the original measurements. The thread just ends at the moment the bones leave local hands and enter an institutional one. Now, the Smithsonian has, in modern times, directly and publicly addressed claims that it engaged in a systematic program of destroying or hiding giant remains, and has stated clearly that no such program existed, and that claims to the contrary are not supported by evidence. I think that response deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed. Institutions denying conspiracy theories about themselves isn't by itself suspicious. It's what you'd expect a real institution to do, regardless of whether the theory was true or false. But here's what that response doesn't fully resolve, for me. It's not really a question about a secret program. It's a question about follow-through. 19th century archaeology, even at its most legitimate, was, by modern standards, chaotic. Provenance wasn't always recorded carefully. Specimens were lost, misfiled, deaccessioned, damaged, or simply never prioritized for study, because they didn't fit into whatever research question was fashionable at the time. An enormous amount of 19th century excavated material from American sites is today simply unaccounted for, not because of a cover-up, but because of a century and a half of underfunded, understaffed, badly documented institutional churn. Which means, if a farmer in 1880-something really did dig up an unusually large skeleton, and really did send it to a museum, the most likely outcome, even with zero conspiracy involved, is that it got logged poorly, stored without much fanfare, and eventually lost to exactly the kind of institutional entropy that swallows millions of other artifacts with far less interesting backstories. In other words, the silence doesn't require a cover-up to explain. Ordinary institutional neglect produces exactly the same silence. But, and here's where I land, because I think this is the honest place to land, ordinary neglect and cover-up produce identical silences from the outside. That's the actual problem. If the bones were never anything unusual, we'd expect this silence. And if the bones were unusual and were quietly deprioritized, lost, or deaccessioned without fanfare, we'd also expect this silence. The silence itself can't tell us which world we're in. So we're stuck asking, are these giants real anomalies? Outlier individuals with genuine skeletal gigantism? A rare but documented medical condition whose remains happen to get reported with extra excitement because of where and how they were found. Are they misidentified animal bones, as the Smithsonian and others have suggested for at least some cases? Are they simple exaggerations, columns filled by bored reporters on slow weeks? Or is there, somewhere in that pile of hundreds of short, flat, unremarkable local reports, a small number describing something that genuinely doesn't fit, remains that, if they still existed and could be examined with modern techniques, would tell us something we don't currently know about the population history of this continent? I don't think we can know, not from where we're sitting. The reports exist. The mounds exist. Many of them still today. You can walk on them. The institutional trail for the specific specimens described as unusually large mostly doesn't exist, for reasons that could be entirely mundane or could be something else, and the silence is identical either way. What I keep coming back to is this: whatever was actually in those mounds, whatever was actually sent away in those crates, on those trains to those museums in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, the opportunity to know definitively, one way or the other, is largely gone. Not because of a single dramatic act of destruction, but because of 150 years of exactly the kind of quiet, undramatic, bureaucratic non-follow-up that doesn't make headlines, doesn't require a conspiracy, and leaves behind exactly the kind of empty space that conspiracy theories and legitimate questions both rush in to fill. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision: a discovery, a brief flurry of local interest, a shipment to an institution, and then silence. Over and over, across decades, across states, the same shape. I don't have bones to show you. I have newspaper columns and the absence of what came after them. And maybe that's the most honest place this particular thread can end, not with an answer, but with a very specific kind of empty space, the same shape repeated so many times that it starts to feel less like an accident and more like a gap shaped like something. Mystery 9. The World's Fair Temporary Buildings. Let's come back to firmer ground, back to the 1800s, back to buildings, except this time buildings that, according to the official record, were never meant to last in the first place. World's Fairs. International expositions, massive temporary cities built to showcase a host nation's industrial and cultural achievements, then by design torn down afterward. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago is the example I want to focus on, because it's so well documented, and because the documentation is exactly what makes it strange. The fairgrounds, known as the White City, covered hundreds of acres and included dozens of enormous neoclassical buildings. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, at the time reportedly the largest roofed structure ever built, the Administration Building with its massive central dome, the Agriculture Building, the Palace of Fine Arts and more, domes, columns, statuary, ornate facades stretching for what photographs show as literal miles of frontage. And the official timeline is this. Construction began in earnest around 1891. The fair opened in May 1893. Less than 2 years for a complex of buildings that, individually, would be considered major architectural achievements today, with modern equipment. Now, I'll grant the obvious counterpoint immediately, because it's a fair one. These buildings weren't built to permanent standards. They were built using a material called staff, essentially a plaster-like composite over wood and structural steel frameworks designed to look like carved stone and marble while being lightweight, fast to produce, and explicitly temporary. That's documented. That's not in dispute. The White City got its name partly from this white staff finish, and the plan from the outset was demolition after the fair closed. So in one sense, the speed makes sense. They weren't carving marble. They were essentially building elaborate stage sets, gorgeous, monumental stage sets, but stage sets. And yet, the level of detail in these buildings, the statuary, the ornamental friezes, the architectural sophistication of structures like the Administration Building's dome, represents an enormous amount of skilled labour. Sculptors, architects, engineers all coordinated across a sprawling site, working to a hard deadline on a project of unprecedented scale, using a building material that, as far as I can tell, had never been deployed at this scale before, anywhere. Where did that workforce come from? Where did that level of coordinated skilled labour, sculptors capable of producing this volume of ornamental work in this time frame, exist ready to be assembled in Chicago in 1891? The fair's own histories describe importing talent from across the country and from Europe, which is itself remarkable, a logistics operation in its own right, coordinating the relocation of hundreds of skilled artisans to a muddy lakefront site and getting a functioning, breathtaking city of palaces out the other side in roughly 24 months. I'm not saying it didn't happen. It's extremely well photographed. There's no shortage of images showing the buildings under construction, scaffolding up, work clearly in progress. This isn't a no evidence of construction situation like some of the buildings we discussed earlier. The construction is documented. What strikes me, instead, is what happened after. The fair closed in late 1893. Most of the buildings were demolished or destroyed by fire within a few years, some intentionally, some in fires that, by this point in our investigation, I think you'll forgive me for raising an eyebrow at. An entire constructed city, the product of one of the largest coordinated building projects in American history to that point, essentially erased within a handful of years of its completion. And what was the long-term legacy of all that effort? A handful of structures survive, the Palace of Fine Arts, rebuilt in permanent materials decades later, as what's now Chicago's Museum of Science and Industry, is essentially the only substantial physical remnant. Everything else exists now only in photographs, postcards, and souvenir programs. Here's the question I keep landing on. Why build something at this level of architectural ambition, genuinely, by every account, breathtaking, influential, the kind of thing that shaped American civic architecture for decades afterward, with the explicit intention of erasing it almost immediately? The official answer is, essentially, that's what World's Fairs are. Spectacle. A snapshot of a moment, deliberately temporary, the architectural equivalent of fireworks, beautiful, expensive, and meant to be gone by morning. And maybe that really is sufficient. Fireworks are expensive and temporary, and we don't consider that mysterious. But I notice that this pattern, extraordinary architectural ambition, compressed timelines, followed by deliberate erasure, isn't unique to the 1893 fair. It's not even unique to World's Fairs. We saw a version of this exact shape, the appear quickly, vanish completely, leave almost no trace except photographs, in the buildings we discussed earlier, the train stations and civic buildings whose construction process is curiously undocumented. Now we have the inverse, buildings whose construction is documented, but whose disappearance follows the same suspiciously total pattern. It's almost as if, across this entire era, the world had developed a remarkable cultural habit. Build something enormous, ornate, and astonishing, and then, within a generation, make sure it's gone, leaving behind only images and a story about why it had to be temporary in the first place. Maybe that's just what ambition looked like in the 19th century. Big, fast, beautiful, and disposable, a physical expression of a culture racing toward the future and unsentimental about the past. Or maybe, and I say this fully aware of how it sounds, maybe a civilization that had recently witnessed within living memory the literal disappearance of cities, names, maps, and entire territorial designations, had simply absorbed as a kind of unconscious cultural reflex the idea that grand things are supposed to vanish. That impermanence wasn't the exception. It was what they'd learned to expect. Mystery 10. Mountains as tree stumps. This is the one that, when I first heard it, I dismissed immediately, outright. I remember actually laughing. The claim, in its simplest form, goes like this. Some of the world's most recognizable rock formations, flat-topped mesas, towering basalt columns, Certain mountains with oddly uniform, almost segmented profiles aren't geological formations at all. They're the remains of trees, not metaphorically. Not ancient and tree-like in appearance. Actual tree stumps, on a scale that would mean the trees they came from were at minimum kilometers tall. I want to be upfront. This is the mystery on this list that pushes hardest against everything we understand about biology, geology, and basic physics. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. A tree that size would face engineering problems, water transport from roots to canopy, structural load bearing, the square cube law, that as far as I understand them, looks genuinely insurmountable for carbon-based plant life, as we know it. So why am I including it? Because once I stopped looking at the conclusion and started looking at the observations that led people to it, I found myself unable to dismiss the observations quite as easily as I dismissed the conclusion. Here's the starting point. Go look at a flat-top mesa, the kind you see across the American Southwest or in parts of Australia, or scattered through certain regions of Africa. The standard geological explanation is erosion. A layer of harder rock on top resisted weathering longer than the softer rock around it, leaving a flat-topped island standing above the surrounding terrain, which itself eroded away over millions of years. That's a real process. It's documented. It happens. I'm not disputing the mechanism. What I started noticing, and what apparently a lot of other people noticed too, independently, which is its own kind of pattern, is the texture. Specifically, the texture of certain basalt formations, long vertical, hexagonal or polygonal columns, packed tightly together, sometimes in stacked layers, with what looks, and I want to stress looks, like growth ring banding running horizontally across the columns at regular intervals. The official explanation for this is columnar basalt, a well-documented phenomenon where cooling lava contracts and cracks into these characteristic hexagonal columns, the same way mud cracks into hexagonal patterns as it dries, just on a much larger scale and with molten rock instead of mud. Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland is the textbook example, and it's genuinely beautiful, and the geology behind it is genuinely well understood. I want to be honest, I find this explanation largely convincing for most of these formations. The hexagonal cracking pattern from thermal contraction is real, it's been reproduced in laboratory conditions at small scale, and it doesn't require inventing any new physics. But here's where the question creeps back in. Some of these formations, not all, but some, show what looks like concentric banding, layer upon layer, in a pattern that, if you saw it on a smaller object, you would immediately call rings. The kind of pattern you'd see if you cut across a tree trunk, or, and this is the comparison that keeps surfacing, the kind of pattern you'd see in a piece of petrified wood, where the original cellular structure of the tree has been replaced, atom by atom, with mineral deposits, while preserving the shape and texture of the original organic material. Petrified wood is real. It's not controversial. It's in museums. We understand the process. Groundwater, rich in dissolved minerals, infiltrates buried wood, and over time silica or other minerals replace the organic material, creating a stone replica that can preserve growth rings, bark texture, even insect damage in extraordinary detail. So the question isn't, can wood become stone? We know it can. The question is one of scale. Is there an upper limit on how large a piece of organic material can be before petrification, or some petrification-like process, becomes implausible? And if there is such a limit, where exactly is it, and how confident are we in that number? I don't have a satisfying answer to that. I don't think anyone does, because as far as I can tell, nobody's seriously researched it, because the premise, kilometre-scale trees, is considered too absurd to warrant the research in the first place, which is itself a strange kind of gap. Most absurd claims at least get a dismissive paper written about them. This one mostly just gets silence or laughter, the same laughter I started with. And here's where I have to be careful, because this is exactly the kind of mystery where it's tempting to stack anomalies that are really just things that look visually similar to something else, without any actual structural relationship. Pareidolia is powerful. Humans are extremely good at seeing trees, faces and animals in random rock formations, and extremely bad at recognizing when we're doing it. So I'm not going to tell you that Devil's Tower in Wyoming is a tree stump. I'm not going to tell you that the mesas of Monument Valley are fossilized roots. What I'll tell you is this. The visual vocabulary of ancient megaflora, bark-like texture on cliff faces, ring-like banding in rock layers, root-like branching patterns in canyon systems carved by water, overlaps suspiciously often with formations that are officially explained through entirely different processes. Erosion here, lava cooling there, sedimentary deposition somewhere else. 3 different processes, 3 different timescales, 3 different explanations, all converging again and again on shapes that a person with no geological training would describe instinctively as looks like wood. Maybe that's just what certain rock formations look like, full stop, and the resemblance to wood is coincidental, the same way clouds resemble animals without containing any animal matter. Or maybe, and I genuinely don't know which of these is true, maybe the reason so many unrelated geological processes produce results that resemble organic structures is that organic structures and certain mineral structures share the same underlying physical principles of growth, stress, and fracture. Crystals branch, lightning branches, river deltas branch, trees branch. The same mathematics, the same fractal branching pattern shows up across systems that have nothing to do with each other, because that pattern is simply what efficient distribution looks like, whether you're distributing sap, electricity, water, or anything else. If that's the answer, then the ancient trees theory isn't wrong exactly. It's just looking at the right pattern and drawing the wrong conclusion about its cause. The branching, the ring-like banding, the bark-like texture, all real, all observable, all genuinely connecting to something deep about how growth and fracture work in the universe, just not literal trees. I'll admit that's a less exciting answer than the Rocky Mountains or stumps, but it's the one that, the more I dug, felt most honest to where the evidence actually points. And yet, I keep coming back to one detail that I can't quite file away. In several regions where these ancient megaflora claims circulate most intensely, you also find, independently, in completely unrelated branches of geology, references to carboniferous deposits of staggering density and extent. Coal. Vast underground seas of compressed fossilized plant matter, the remains of forests that genuinely did exist, genuinely were enormous by any standard, and genuinely did get buried, compressed, and transformed into something else entirely, over time. We know the Earth has, in its history, produced plant life at a scale that's hard to intuitively grasp, entire eras defined by it, entire layers of the geological record made of nothing but compressed former forest. That's not speculation, that's coal mining. So when someone looks at a strange rock formation and says, "What if this used to be a tree?" they're not pulling the concept of ancient Earth was covered in plant matter on a scale we can barely imagine, out of nowhere. That concept is, in a very real sense, already part of the accepted geological record. What's being questioned isn't whether ancient Earth had enormous quantities of plant matter. It obviously did, by the ton, by the layer. What's being questioned is the form that plant matter took, and whether some of what we now call mountains might be more directly continuous with that record than the official explanation, erosion, deposition, volcanism currently, allows for. I don't know. I really don't. This is the mystery on the list where I feel least equipped to draw any conclusion at all, and most aware that I might just be looking at shapes in clouds. But the silence around even asking the question, the instant dismissal, the laughter, the total absence of any serious attempt to define where "this is just erosion" ends, and "this requires a different explanation" begins. That silence is the part that stays with me. Because every other mystery on this list, so far has involved human history, records, maps, names, buildings, books. This one reaches back further, geological time. And if even a fraction of what's being described turns out to point at something real, some process, some era, some scale of life that doesn't fit our current models, then everything else on this list, all of it, would have to be re-examined in the light of a much, much older anomaly. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying I noticed that nobody's checked, so that's where I'll leave it. For now. Buried ground floors. A frozen continent that got its own international treaty almost the moment people started looking at it seriously. 1,000 renamed cities, with one state alone accounting for half the total. An architectural style that appears fully formed on every continent, with no documented construction process. An encyclopedia that quietly erased the largest country on Earth, one edition at a time. 2 centuries of library fires that between them took almost everything we could have used to check any of this against the original sources. Mountains that might be something else entirely. And 150 years of bones that went into the ground and then into a crate and then nowhere at all. None of these on their own prove anything. I want to be honest about that, the way I've tried to be honest throughout. Fires happen, names change, styles spread, bones get lost. Each of these individually has an explanation that doesn't require anything strange. But I keep coming back to the shape of it, the same shape, over and over, something large, something that should have left a trail and then a gap exactly where the trail should be. We've covered 10 of these so far, there are 10 more, and the next 10 get stranger. Domes that may have done more than just look impressive. Bridges built for traffic that never existed. A calendar with a missing month. Bells that don't sound the way bells are supposed to sound anymore. Canals carved with a precision that shouldn't have been possible. And a question, right at the end, that I'm still not sure I want the answer to. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting with the questions, even the ones I couldn't answer. Especially those. Part 2 starts where this leaves off, with free energy and the buildings that may have been built to hold it.